Realm of Ruins by Jeppe Broch Anderson, Prologue. Gendry woke to the sound of silence, a heavy, deafening silence that filled the misty landscape around him, only broken by the occasional crackle from the last slowly dying flames. His head throbbed with insistent pain, a suffocating hum that made him blink away the stars from his vision. He felt the cold, clammy earth beneath him, the smell of wet mud mixed with the metallic sting of blood and burnt flesh. A blow to the head, that was the last thing he could remember. Then there had been darkness. Now he was awake, alive, but surrounded by death. He forced himself up onto his elbows. His limbs felt heavy, as if he had been dragged down into the earth alongside the dead. His surroundings swam in his vision as he sat up, and slowly the memories returned. The battle, that hellish battle they had fought here, on the wrong side of Thangor's passage. Now it was over, but no one had won. Death was all that remained. His gaze swept across the battlefield. Men lay scattered like fallen dolls, their bodies crushed and twisted, lying in pools of blood that had darkened and saturated the ground beneath them. Weapons were strewn everywhere, swords, axes, spears, some broken, others still clenched in the hands of the dead. The armor was shattered, torn apart by fatal blows. Some of the corpses were no longer recognizable as men, their faces crushed, their bodies burnt to shells of what they had once been. The crows had already begun to gather. Their black, stern figures flew low over the bodies, their eyes staring as if they were patiently waiting for death's silence to finally signal their feast. Somewhere closer, he could hear the sound of the first ones landing, with a satisfied screech, pecking into the exposed flesh. Flies buzzed around him like small black devils, swirling in and out of eye sockets and open wounds. He took a deep breath and tasted the smell of smoke, of ash, of blood clinging to the damp air. With each breath he felt the suffocating darkness in his mind deepen. This was what war led to, not honor, not victory, only death. As a child, he had listened to stories of great knights, mighty kings who, with sword and courage, had conquered enemy lands and how they had inscribed their deeds into the history books. He had pictured how they rode into battle clad in gleaming armor and how they returned home with laurels of honor and a trophy of their latest victory. But here, in this inferno of blood and bones, it all looked different. There were no grand epic battles, no victory songs, only raw violence, shattered bodies, and men forgotten like manure in the field. He wondered if the great knights had ever seen anything like this, or if those who had told the stories had ever smelled the heavy, nauseating stench of death. Somewhere in the distance a branch creaked in the wind, as if the forest itself was treading carefully around what had happened here. The trees, which had once stood like proud pillars, were now splintered and bent under the weight of war. The pines, which had grown tall and strong in this valley, were now ravaged by the fire that still smoldered in their roots. The flames had licked up their trunks, leaving black scars where the bark had burst away. The mist drifting in from the mountains made the sight of the charred trees even more surreal, like ghosts guarding a graveyard. Gendry struggled to his feet, but they wobbled beneath him, weak, like a calf newly born. He supported himself with a weapon, not knowing if it was his or someone else's, and stared out over the horrors in front of him. All those men, many of them he knew. They had fought side by side, starved and frozen together. Some of them had spoken about their families, about how they would return home when this madness was over. Now they lay here lifeless, erased by King Laenor, the lion's ambitions. There was no homecoming for them. His thoughts turned to home, back on the farm, far to the south, where the soil was fertile and the rain didn't feel like this cold, constant dampness, but like a blessing. He could almost hear his father's voice, rough and strong, explaining how to turn the soil, how the crops needed attention. His father with the bad knee that had prevented him from fighting in yet another of the king's damned wars. His mother, always with her hands deep in the soil or the dough, their little house in the middle of the fields where the world still felt simple. And his little sister Mara. She was only 6 summers old, but with the biggest smile and the clearest eyes. She could make him forget how miserable their life was, how the war had drained the life from the village's men, how famine loomed closer with each passing year, and how the work on the farm grew heavier with every passing season. He had promised himself that he would return to them, but now, in the middle of this nightmare, that lie felt heavy in his chest. Why was he even fighting? This was Laenor the Lion's war, not his. What did it matter to him who sat on the throne? What did it matter to a farmer whose king had betrayed him by dragging him away from the field and into death? The thoughts twisted in his mind. Maybe he should just desert, run. Forget this hell and try to find his way home, but the fear of what would happen if he were caught. He knew what the king did to deserters. They were hanged high and long for all to see. Gendry pressed his hands to his temples and tried to push the fear away, but it hung over him like a heavy cloud. He didn't know how to escape this. The war had taken everything from him. His future felt empty, no matter what he did. Even if he survived this day, he would still be bound to a war he didn't believe in, to a king who saw him as nothing more than meat for the slaughter. There was silence now, not a peaceful silence, but the deafening kind that only comes after massive destruction. Gendry could hear his own breathing, heavy and labored. The world felt empty, abandoned by everything living, only left with death and its dark shadows. A frightening thought crossed his mind, and his gaze flickered toward the thick edge of the forest. Maybe it hadn't been only human hands that played a role in what he had just survived. Maybe something else was at play, something older. The darkness in the woods had always felt strange. He shuddered at the thought and forced himself to take a step forward, away from the dead earth. A cold breeze brushed his face, and Gendry suddenly froze. Something had changed in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation. His eyes scanned the battlefield again, but this time a sense of unease crept over him, a crawling feeling that hadn't been there before. The men around him were dead, no doubt about that, but now it was as if death itself had shifted, as if something in the silence was waiting. A creeping sensation that sliced into his mind. Then he saw him. A figure dressed in black stood, hunched over a corpse nearby. Closer to the forest's edge, the man wore a long dark cloak that draped over his shoulders, almost like woven darkness spilling across the already shadowed battlefield. Gendry couldn't see the man's face, but it was clear he was engrossed in something. His hands moved slowly, almost ritually, over the dead man's body. Gendry stared, both curious and terrified. "Who in the world?" he whispered to himself. He considered shouting out, but his tongue felt like lead in his mouth. There was something about this man that tightened fear around Gendry's chest, something unnatural. Then, without a sound, the man dressed in black dissolved, melting away like smoke into the mist. Only the body of the corpse remained, and then the corpse moved. At first, Gendry saw it as a twitch, an almost involuntary jerk in the man's body, as if he were waking from a deep sleep, but it wasn't sleep. The man, who had been lying dead, slowly turned his head, his eyes, or what was left of them, completely white, vacant. His jaw was broken, hanging crooked and lifeless, while the milky shine in his pupilless eyes stared into nothingness. Gendry gasped aloud, shocked and horrified. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as if trying to break free. The corpse rose slowly, its movements stiff and uncoordinated, but there was an unmistakable awareness behind them, as though something had taken control of the dead body. The world around him transformed from battlefield to something far darker. Gendry instinctively grasped the sword lying beside him on the ground. It wasn't his own, but it was heavy and real, and right now it was his only defense against whatever was unfolding before him. His heart raced in his chest, and a cold sensation crawled down his spine. He needed to get out of here. When the dead man turned in his direction, and Gendry saw those expressionless, white eyes staring directly at him, something inside him snapped. An overwhelming panic seized his body. He couldn't think clearly. The only thing left was the instinct to flee. Gendry stood up, his legs unsteady as he stumbled backward. His eyes darted to where the man in black had vanished, then to the corpse that had risen, moving toward him with those haunting empty eyes. The horror of it tightened like a vice around his chest. As he watched, more corpses began to twitch, their movements jerky and grotesque. Some rose to their feet, while others struggled against the pull of death that seemed to lose its hold. Gendry's heart raced as he took in the nightmarish scene unfolding before him. This was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard being emptied of its dead cargo. Without a second thought, Gendry turned and ran. He ran as if all the gates of death had opened behind him. His feet stumbled over the soft, blood-soaked earth as he rushed toward the forest. Behind him, he could hear rattling, creaking sounds, as if the dead were trying to follow. Every movement of his legs felt like a battle, every breath like a veil of fear choking him. The battlefield crows screamed from the treetops, as if warning him, but he ignored everything. Only the escape mattered now. Flies buzzed thick around him, swirling through the corpses and their open wounds. But even their constant claustrophobic presence was nothing compared to the terror driving him forward. The forest swallowed him quickly. The shadows of the trees grew denser the deeper he ran, and the fog lay like a heavy cloak over everything. The pine branches rustled above him, but he didn't care. He couldn't stay here, not near them. A whimper escaped his lips as he slipped on a muddy slope, but he forced himself up again, screaming inwardly for the last remnants of strength. He had to get away. There was no safety here, no comrades to turn to. The only thing waiting for him behind was a fate worse than death. And yet, even as he ran, he couldn't shake the final thought. What in the world had he just witnessed? Thank you for tuning in to Realm of Ruins. Don't forget to like and follow to keep the story going.